When I say the word economy, what comes to mind? Do you consider it to be the lifeblood of all society? Or do you see it as just being synonymous with money? Or maybe you're just simply reminded of the taxes and the price tags, which made you dig further into your pockets than you had to a couple months ago. Maybe you imagine something else entirely. Based on our personal exposure and experience with a topic, we will all define the economy in a different way. But not all definitions are right. In fact, the economy is often misunderstood, with interpretations greatly influenced by its most obvious impacts. Look around. Have you noticed, for example, the random, seemingly the chaotic fluctuations of gas prices recently? Maybe a drink from the supermarket or food from a restaurant costs more than you remember. Do you know someone who is currently trying to fight off a seemingly insatiable debt? For all of these things, the economy is directly responsible. From something as complex as the nation's categorized wealth in the form of the gross domestic product, to something as simple as purchasing a gym membership. There are an uncountable number of factors that can influence the flow and transference of funds across the globe. Staying financially stable in this world involves trying your very best to account for as many of these factors as possible. Many Americans, however, especially the young and inexperienced, lose financial stability to forces outside of their control and suffer monumental consequences with little hope of ever regaining what they had lost. Our focus then must be on preventing this fate for ourselves. But how do we do this? A global economic recession is on the horizon, brought about by the primary flaws of the current world economy. These include a lack of direction, grandiose overspending, and ineffective intervention from the government. But by gaining a proper understanding of the impending crisis, we permit educated decision-making in the near future with hopes not to prevent, but to prepare for any trial or difficulty the future may hold. So, what exactly is a recession? The website whitehouse.gov quotes the National Bureau of Economic Research, who defines a recession as a significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and that lasts for more than a few months. The typical areas of society that are affected by a recession are personal income, employment, consumer spending, and industrial production. Since 2021, America has experienced steadily increasing unemployment rates and consumer spending, a trend quite unlike the stability of the previous decade. It is this abnormality that raises concern, along with its similarities to data from times of known economic crises. So in my speech, I plan to discuss the details of these concerns and draw conclusions about the current economic landscape. First, I will discuss the state of the economy today and the effects of the recent coronavirus pandemic upon it. I will then identify problems that the economy has faced for decades, poor decision-making by the federal government, and the ever-wavering stability of the stock market. From this, I will analyze historical events to demonstrate how we should expect another recession in the near future. And finally, I will pull from modern and scriptural examples to demonstrate the best way to solving this upcoming recession and how to best prepare for crises to come. The COVID-19 epidemic, still fresh in our memory, brought about immense changes to the global economy, changes that could bring financial ruin if left neglected. The current instability within the economy, however, has resulted less from the pandemic itself and more from the world's reaction to it. To obtain a professional's perspective, I interviewed Richard Thomas, an economist and market strategist at Touchstone Investments. In the interview, he describes how today's environment is much more a function of the pandemic and the monetary and fiscal stimulus that was applied to offset the economic fallout from the pandemic. And that's the key word here, offset. That is what these actions were designed to do, offset the potential fiscal disaster that would result from the pandemic. But how exactly does a sickness, a disease, represent a significant threat to an economy? Consider it like this. The financial health of America is like a set of bowling pins in a bowling alley. COVID-19 is a bowling ball that is rolling towards the pins, aiming to topple them all over. Each pin in this case represents a socioeconomic setback, think inflation or high unemployment rates. Knock only one over, and it's not that big of an impact. America survives, and we can recover. But topple them all over simultaneously, and a massive recession strikes the economy, toppling the order and stability that was previously there. In response to a budding epidemic, state governments implemented preventative methods. You know them: quarantines, mask wearing, social distancing, all in an attempt to curb the spread of the disease. These precautions, however, left many businesses without their normal influx of customers, bankrupting millions in the following years. Their sudden disappearance left millions of people unemployed. It became the responsibility of the federal government to provide monetary care to the jobless. Unfortunately, this assistance from the government, while necessary towards maintaining a stable society, incentivized many to counterintuitively remain unemployed. After all, if the government is paying for your bills, why would you work? These efforts were not entirely without merit. Thousands of people were financially saved by these checks from the government. But for the massive majority, it only made matters worse. Even today, years after the government's assistance, businesses worldwide struggle to employ enough workers. With more and more focus being placed on one's own financial well-being, the national economy has received more and more neglect. Paolo Sabacci, a professor of economics in London, explains that as citizens and policymakers are confronted with the impact of the pandemic on a day-to-day basis, the world economy is in freefall. All economic indicators, she concludes, points to a global recession worse than the one that followed the global financial crisis of 2008. In many ways, the individualistic mindset of today is quite similar to the avaricious goals that brought about previous financial crises throughout history. When everyone is out for themselves, the economy crumbles, and a crumbling economy affects not just its citizens, but the entire world. In times of economic despair, when greed and avarice run rampant, it should be the responsibility of federal governments to repair and revise the economy. However, time and time again, they have consistently failed in accomplishing this task. Their sub-satisfactory assistance extends beyond the pandemic, with implemented financial mandates and stimulus checks often harming the economy more than helping it. The counterintuitive effects of government intervention represent a significant hindrance on the road to economic revision. In 2020, Congress released the CARES Act, which stands for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. It was one of several economic stimulus packages that the U.S. government released during COVID-19. Its provisions included $500 billion in loans for businesses, cities, and states. Supposedly, this money was intended to keep businesses open and cities stable. However, this quickly proved to not be the case whatsoever. The government's forced stimulus of the economy only resulted in closing more businesses, failing to accomplish in what they were designed to do. This is not even the first time that government actions on the economy have backfired so counterintuitively. During the 1980s, an economic plan implemented by Ronald Reagan during his presidency, aptly named Reaganomics, had the potential to be a major turning point in the American economy. The fiscal improvements of Reaganomics, however, hypothesized by Reagan and his executive branch, do not have many lasting impacts that we can notice today. Why is this? After all, according to Reagan and his running mate, Americans by 1984 had regained their optimism and faith. Gigantic increases in federal debt were treated as a temporary but necessary artifact on the road back to prosperity. Reagan's dream was an overhaul of the 1980s economy, prioritizing lower taxation and less governmental intervention and spending. Unfortunately for Reagan, those gigantic increases in federal debt never went away. In fact, federal debt had tripled since Reaganomics began. Thus, to prevent a major economic fallout, the president was forced to pull the brakes on his economic plan. With deficits reaching stratospheric highs, Reagan revised his plans, adopting a justification for deficit spending in spite of the reality that he had spent a lifetime opposing this. A baseless hope that the flaws in his plan would simply disappear brought a sudden and bittersweet end to Reagan's lofty dreams of reform. Both the CARES Act of 2020 and Reaganomics failed for the exact same reason. Vast oversights, alongside a blind faith that said oversights would not undermine everything that they had built to last. So, how do we guarantee that a leader like Reagan, seeking national change and revision, who would flip the economy entirely on its head, would not share these same short-sighted dreams? Is it even possible to learn from history? Only one thing is for sure. If our government cannot keep up with an ever-changing economy, Positive reform for the future is nothing short of impossible. In a discussion about the economics of the world, it would be short-sighted not to mention the stock market. The stock market, the buying and selling of company shares and stocks en masse, represents an integral component of the economy, with its stability often defining the financial health of the entire nation. Money placed into digital stocks or other online financial markets is considered liquid money. The name exemplifies the fluid and constantly shifting nature of these funds. However, since this liquid money often lacks a physical counterpart, it manifests a significant risk if the demand for money exceeds the supply found in banks. This element of the stock market represents one of the innumerable variables that can dictate the direction the stock market travels. Stock prices can fall if investors believe that companies are not going to make money. Concerned investors will try to quickly sell stock before the stock loses value. And if investors won't buy new stock, the stock market will fall. This was the case for the stock market crash of 1929. The prices of stocks saw a great decline, leading to millions of shareholders trading in their liquid money for solid cash at the nearest banks. As a result, most banks across the nation, entirely out of money with nothing but liquid cash to their names, were forced out of business. The years afterward became known as the Great Depression, which remains the worst economic collapse America has ever faced. Since then, measures have been established to prevent such a thing from happening again. But how effective are these measures? Yale professor of economics Robert J. Shiller provides his understanding of these federally issued measures. He states that when an asset is underpriced, incentives are created to neglect or abuse it, and that when they are overpriced, incentives are created to invest too many resources into it. The intention of this strategy is to maintain a balance in the stock prices, but this method is never used to its greatest potential. An active intervention and maintenance of the stock market by the government would upset and worry the populace. So the government just simply downplays the economic issues in fear of sparking an irrational uproar, as was the case in the 1920s market crash. Ultimately, this accomplishes nothing towards correcting the core of the issue. Comparisons between our modern economic dilemma and the global depression of the 1920s reveals reasoning behind why this type of fiscal crisis can happen again. A look back in history explains how these economic recessions occur in the first place. Peter Temet, a professor of economics at MIT, describes World War I as a paroxysm of violence that brought the long economic expansion of the 19th century to a sudden end, which produced the imbalance that led to the Depression. In the case of the Great Depression, it was the sudden lack of necessity in so many things that were the staples of life during the war that brought about financial collapse. So, could an economic crisis of this capacity happen again? Many modern economists would disagree. They would say that it is improbable that the world would ever face a recession similar to the Great Depression due to a lack of conflicts stressing the field of finance. In my interview with Richard Thomas, he states not seeing many similarities with the 1930s economically. At the time, he states, America was an emerging economy going through a depression, and today she is a developed, mature economy simply experiencing a slowdown. While the world has made many precautions towards preventing a crisis on par with the Great Depression, a global recession, albeit less impactful overall, will still affect the lives of millions. And the world has had its fair share of recessions ever since the 1930s, because ever since then, the economy has unpredictably fluctuated from times of silent security to moments of immense insecurity. In the early 2000s, a massive recession hit the United States, sending unemployment rates up to levels not seen in decades. This was later called the Great Recession. Robert J. Shiller, the professor of economics at Yale, calls the years before the market crashes of 1929 and 1987 periods of fairly steady increases in stock prices. The two examples, however, were never considered similar enough as to compel writers to take note of it. The Great Depression and the Great Recession, despite their very similar names, are not often compared to one another when considering the plan for a future economy. Granted, both had very different historical circumstances. The Great Recession, occurring in the early 20th century, was the result of a poor economic transition from a time of intensive war to one of worldwide peace. Meanwhile, the Great Recession was a sudden and devastating crash in market prices in the 2000s. Despite these differences, the effects of both crises, higher unemployment, lower morale, less confidence in the Federal Reserve Board, are vastly analogous. When these recessions occur, regardless of time or reasoning, the world is somehow always taken by surprise, with little to no forewarning or preventative action to soften their blows whatsoever. Economists tend to agree to the cyclical circumstance of causality and its intentions to the intentional edifications to the economy. Richard Thomas agrees that there are elements of cause and effect that repeat. When the Fed tightens monetary policy, it slows economic growth. And this slowing can trigger or ignite other downfalls that can magnify the downturn. While these patterns have been identified and monitored over the decades, it has not done much to prevent the regional or even global recessions that continually make the lives of millions miserable. A recession will always be on the horizon. But perhaps there is more that can be done to prevent them, something more than just a simple observance of the past. So, what can we do to prepare for future recessions? First, it is essential that we use our time efficiently before upcoming crises. Productivity is the main contributor to economic growth and therefore to improvement in the living standard. Second, to properly maintain a globally operational economy, it is necessary that the world is united and cooperative in action. Professor Paola Subacci explains that if we are to have any chance of fighting both the pandemic and the global recession, we need coordinated international action and strong multilateral institutions from which we can enact measures to ensure that our world is prevented from ever falling into such a crisis again. Economic recessions continue to occur today because we are disorganized and unwilling to learn from history. Therefore, what can we do to prepare for future recessions? Immediate and deliberative action together. Thank you. Before effectual action can be taken, however, we must consult God's wisdom and understanding. For this understanding, we mustn't look any further than the Bible, where instructions for receiving and maintaining wisdom and judicious discretion can be found. Hebrews 13:16 calls for us to not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. While rejecting the selfish and avaricious option is a struggle for everyone, the Lord reassures us that He understands the sacrifices we are making and is pleased by our commitment. However, Scripture is not always so positive towards possessing great wealth. To those obstinate and prideful in their wealth, God has a very different message. He says, "For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing," not realizing that you are wretched, poor, pitiable, blind, and naked. Additionally, in Matthew, Christ comments on a rich man's stubbornness, saying that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Overall, however, God just asks for us to understand one simple truth. Repeatedly throughout the Bible, He demonstrates the truly temporary nature of monetary things. In the parable of the pearl of great value, Jesus explains that the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who, upon finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Ultimately, wealth on this earth is worth nothing in comparison to the treasures awaiting us in heaven. Believing these words quells our human desires and sets our eyes on more permanent and glorious things. Truly, the best way to deal with economic crises comes from a focused mind and a heart centered around Christ. The economy is far from perfect. The lifeblood of our society, the backbone of the modern world, has the potential to fall apart in a single day. Regardless of what anyone can do, the imperfect nature of human error will always lead to debt, decline, and disaster. In this chaotic sea of finance, there is only so much we can do to stay afloat. But what we can do, we must do deliberately and in unity. So when you hear the word economy, I hope you see it as more than just money. I hope you recognize it as an excellent opportunity for proactivity and productivity, and a continuous reminder to remain focused in what is relevant and true. Thank you.